My name is Marisol Vidal. I am 34 years old, and I used to believe that if you built something real, something with your own hands, your own hours, your own money, no one could take it from you. I was wrong. I should tell you what I actually built before I tell you what happened to it, because the story doesn't make sense otherwise. People hear family business dispute, and they picture a dusty hardware store with a handshake agreement and a will written on a napkin. That is not what this was. I ran, depending on which version of reality you were living in during the fall of 2 years ago, a logistics coordination firm. We handled last-mile delivery contracts for regional grocery chains and mid-size pharmaceutical distributors across 4 states. I started it when I was 26 years old with $41,000 I had saved working double shifts as an operations coordinator for a freight company outside of Columbus, Ohio. I rented a desk inside a shared office on the east side of the city. I used a folding table as my second desk. I answered my own phone. And from the very first month, I kept every document that touched that company. Every filing, every amendment, every contract, in an accordion folder I labeled by hand and stored in my home filing cabinet. Mid-video hook, inserted at approximately word 300. By the time I was 32, we had 23 full-time employees, contracts with 6 regional clients, and gross revenue just under $3 million annually. I had an operations manager I trusted, a 2-year lease on a real office, and a line of credit I had never once needed to draw on because I ran the margins carefully and paid vendors early. The business was not glamorous. It was functional and it was profitable, and I had built every part of it. If you've ever built something from nothing and watched someone close to you look at it and slowly decide it belongs to them, you already know where this story is going. Think about that for a second. My father's name is Rodrigo Vidal. He is 61 years old, and he spent most of my childhood running a mid-sized trucking brokerage that he inherited from his own father. He knows the logistics world. He understands margins, he understands carrier relationships, he understands what it means when a client threatens to pull a contract. He is not a stupid man. I want to be clear about that, because what happened was not stupidity. It was something more deliberate. When I was 27 and the business was 8 months old, my father offered to help. He had contacts I didn't have, carrier relationships built over 30 years that would have taken me a decade to replicate on my own. He introduced me to 2 clients who became anchor accounts. In exchange, I gave him a 10% advisory stake. We signed a single-page agreement that my attorney at the time, a general practice lawyer I was paying by the hour because I couldn't afford a retainer, drafted in an afternoon. It said he held 10% in an advisory capacity, non-voting, with no operational authority. I thought that was the end of it. If you've ever watched someone you love look at something you built and slowly decide it belongs to them, you know how it starts. It doesn't start with a fight. It starts with suggestions. Then opinions. Then the opinions come with a particular tone, like they are correcting a mistake rather than offering a thought. I noticed it. I told myself I was being sensitive. My sister's name is Renata. She is 38 years old, 4 years older than me, and she has worked for my father's brokerage since she was 22. She is good at her job. She manages his carrier relationships with a precision that I genuinely admired. She also grew up understanding, in the way that certain children absorb without being told, that she was the one my father had chosen. Not chosen for anything specific. Just chosen, in the general ongoing way that plays out across thousands of small moments over a lifetime. I understood it too. I had understood it since I was 9 years old, and my father took Renata to his office on a Saturday to show her the dispatch system while I stayed home with my mother. He didn't explain why I wasn't invited. He didn't need to. I built my company partly because of that Saturday. I have never said that out loud to anyone, but it is true. The envelope that changed everything was sitting on my kitchen table on a Thursday morning in early November when I got home from a client meeting. My father had dropped it off. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't knocked. My mother still had a key to my apartment from when she'd watered my plants the previous summer. The envelope had my name on it in my father's handwriting. I set my bag down next to it and stood in my kitchen for a moment before I opened it. That moment, standing in my kitchen with my coat still on, is where this story really begins. I did not open the envelope that morning. I put it on the kitchen counter and went to shower and change and eat something, because I had learned a long time ago that my father's letters were best read when I was not already tired. The first time my father made clear what he thought of my company. Not the idea of it, but the reality of it, the version that actually existed and had actual clients. I was 29 years old. The business was 14 months old. I had just signed my second anchor contract, a 2-year agreement with a regional grocery chain out of Dayton that represented a 38% increase in projected annual revenue. I was proud. I called him on a Tuesday evening to tell him. He listened. He let me finish. Then he said, "That's good, Marisol. Just make sure you're not overextending." I said, "I'm not overextending. I ran the capacity models. We can absorb it." He said, "I'm sure you think so." I squared my shoulders and said nothing for a moment. That was the beginning of a particular kind of sentence, "I'm sure you think so," that my father used for the next 5 years whenever I told him something I had figured out. It was never an argument. He never said I was wrong. He said, "I'm sure you think so," which is a different thing entirely, because you cannot push back against it without sounding defensive, and sounding defensive was exactly what he wanted. The incident I want to tell you about, the one that made the pattern undeniable, happened 18 months later at a dinner my parents hosted at their house in Westerville. It was a Sunday in March. My mother made her lamb stew. My father had invited my uncle Felix, who had sold his own small brokerage 5 years earlier and spent most of his retirement talking about the sale. We were at the table. My father was describing a carrier deal he'd restructured for his own company, a rate renegotiation that had taken him 3 months to close. He was proud of it. Uncle Felix was asking questions. I had just completed a similar renegotiation 2 weeks earlier, faster, with a carrier that was harder to move, and I mentioned it. Not to redirect the conversation. Just to mention it. My father glanced at Renata. It was a quick glance, barely a second, but I saw it and Renata saw it and we both knew what it meant. Then he said, "Marisol's doing her little venture," and continued talking to Felix about his deal. Her little venture. I was generating over $1 million in annual revenue at that point. I had employees. I had contracts with real termination clauses and real liability provisions. I picked up my fork and used it to straighten the edge of the cloth napkin beside my plate, and I did not say anything. Renata did not correct him. She looked at her bowl. My mother said, "Rodrigo," in a quiet voice, the way she said his name when she wanted him to stop without wanting to fight about it. He did not stop. He finished his story about the carrier deal. Felix congratulated him. Dessert came out. I drove home that night replaying the word little. Not because it hurt in the way that obvious cruelty hurts. I had developed, by then, a reasonable tolerance for his particular register, but because of the glance. The glance at Renata before he said it. That glance was not careless. That glance was a check-in. He wanted to make sure she was watching. I didn't know what I was witnessing then. I know now. The pattern after that was consistent. At every family gathering where my company came up, my father found a way to position it as small, provisional, amateur. Marisol's still figuring it out. It's a good learning experience for her. She doesn't have the volume yet to really stress test the model. Each sentence was delivered mildly, almost kindly, the way you talk about a child's school project rather than a functioning business. Renata almost never joined in directly. She didn't need to. She would nod or she would say nothing, and her silence carried the same weight as agreement because she was the one person at that table whose opinion my father actually respected, and she never once said, "Dad, that's not fair." There was one evening, I was 31, the business had crossed $2 million in annual revenue for the first time, when I made the mistake of bringing a document to dinner. Not to make a point. I had a question about a carrier contract clause and my father had dealt with the same carrier in the past. I pulled out the contract summary and set it on the table next to his water glass. He looked at it for 5 seconds. Then he pushed it back toward me without touching it and said, "I don't need to read it. You're fine." "I wasn't asking you to validate it," I said. "I had a specific question about indemnification language." "Marisol." He said my name the way he said my name when he considered a conversation over. "You'll figure it out." I folded the contract summary in half and put it back in my bag. I did not say anything else about it that night. Felix refilled his wine and my mother asked Renata about a vacation she was planning, and the evening continued. I figured it out. I always figured it out. That was the part none of them seemed to find remarkable. The strange thing about being systematically underestimated by someone who loves you, or who functions as love in the particular way that certain fathers do, is that you spend years finding explanations that protect them. He's old-fashioned. He doesn't know how to show pride without making it a competition. He grew up in a different era. He built something himself, so he can't admit that someone else built something better. I cycled through all of those. I held on to each one for a while. I let them go one by one as the evidence accumulated. Let me tell you what I actually did during those years, because my father's narration of this story, the version he was telling himself and Renata and Felix and anyone else who would listen, contained almost none of it. I rebuilt the company's carrier network from scratch in year 2. The original network I had assembled was functional but thin. When one of my primary carriers had a fleet issue that took 30% of their capacity offline for 6 weeks, I absorbed the disruption without losing a single client contract. I did that by spending 4 straight weeks on the phone building relationships with backup carriers in 3 states, negotiating short-term rate agreements, and personally calling every affected client to give them weekly updates. My operations manager, a man named Troy who had been with me since month 8, told me afterward that he had never seen anyone work a crisis the way I worked that one. I didn't tell my father about it. He would have found a way to make it sound ordinary. I renegotiated our primary pharmaceutical client's contract in year 3. The original agreement had been signed when we were smaller, and the rate structure reflected that. We were leaving money on the table at the volume we were doing by then. I spent 11 weeks preparing the renegotiation. I built a full cost model, documented every performance metric we had hit over 2 years, researched the client's own margins so I understood what they could absorb, and went into that meeting knowing every number they were going to throw at me before they threw it. We came out with a 15% rate increase and a contract extension. The client's procurement director sent me a handwritten note afterward. I kept it. That same year, I hired 2 additional full-time operations staff and implemented a client reporting system that reduced our average response time on service inquiries from 48 hours to 11. I built the reporting template myself, working 2 Saturdays in a row, because I couldn't afford to hire a systems consultant and I didn't want to wait. In year 4, we expanded into a second state, Kentucky, after I spent 8 months cultivating a relationship with a mid-size grocery cooperative there. I drove to their headquarters 3 times before they agreed to a meeting. The 3rd time I drove there and back in a single day, 9 hours round trip, because I had a client call the following morning that I couldn't reschedule. I ate a gas station sandwich in a parking lot in Lexington and answered emails on my phone before I got back on the highway. I signed that contract 4 months later. In year 5, I negotiated our first bank line of credit, $250,000, secured against receivables, with terms I was genuinely proud of. I didn't need it. I opened it because a business without access to liquidity is one bad quarter away from a decision it shouldn't have to make, and I had watched my father's own company get squeezed once in the 90s for exactly that reason. He had told me that story himself when I was 16. I remembered it. I built the line of credit because of that story, and I never told him I had done it or why. My father attended 2 events associated with my company during those 6 years. One was a client appreciation dinner I hosted in year 3, which he attended for 45 minutes and left early because of a prior commitment I was never able to identify. The other was a meeting I asked him to take with me in year 4, with a prospective carrier, because his name still carried weight in the regional freight community and I was trying to get the meeting taken seriously. He came. He shook hands. He let me run the meeting, and I ran it well, and on the drive back to my office he said, "You talk too fast." I did not talk too fast. But here is what I remember most clearly from those 6 years, and this is the part my father never saw or never chose to see. There were nights, usually in winter, when the office was empty and I was the last one there, when I would sit at my desk and look at the numbers for the week and feel something that I did not have a clean word for. It was not happiness exactly, and it was not pride exactly. It was closer to recognition. I said I was going to do this, and I am doing it. My chest would feel tight in a way that wasn't quite breathing, like something was pressing outward from inside my ribs. I built those nights into the walls of that company the way you build load-bearing things. Quietly, without ceremony, in a way that doesn't show from the outside but holds everything up. Renata visited my office once. She came by on a Wednesday afternoon in the fall of year 4, unannounced, and stood in the reception area looking at the wall where I had mounted the company's client roster. Not the logos, just the names, printed on cardstock and framed simply because I'd had the idea and liked it. She looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad thinks you should have a partner. Someone with more industry history." I looked at her. She was not looking at me. She was still looking at the wall. "I don't need a partner," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm just telling you what he thinks." She left 20 minutes later. It was the only time she visited. I opened the envelope on a Thursday evening. Inside was a single folded letter, written on my father's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with his initials embossed at the top that he had used for formal correspondence since I was a child. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said that he had been doing some long-term thinking about the family's assets and wanted to make sure everything was properly structured going forward. The second paragraph said that he had been working with an attorney to review all relevant holdings, a phrase that took me 2 readings to parse, and that he wanted to schedule a family meeting to discuss some decisions he had made. The third paragraph said he loved me and was proud of everything I had accomplished. I read the letter 3 times standing at my kitchen counter. The phrase that snagged me was all relevant holdings. My company was not a family holding. It was mine. I had incorporated it. I had capitalized it. I had signed every contract. My father held a 10% advisory stake with no operational authority. That was the entire extent of his involvement on paper. All relevant holdings. I called my father that evening. He answered on the second ring. "I got your letter," I said. "Good," he said. "I was hoping we could all sit down before Thanksgiving. It would be nice to do it as a family." "What decisions are you talking about, Dad?" A pause. "I'd rather go through everything properly with everyone together." "I understand that," I said. "But I'm asking you directly. Are you talking about my company?" Another pause. Longer. "We can talk about everything at the meeting." I squared the letter on the counter in front of me before I said anything else. "Dad," I said, "I need to know if this involves my company." "Marisol." He said my name in that particular way. "I have done a great deal for that business. I think you know that. I introduced you to 2 of your largest clients. I gave you the credibility to open doors you couldn't have opened alone. I've never asked for recognition for any of that." "You hold 10% in an advisory capacity," I said. "Non-voting." We signed a document. "Documents can be revisited," he said. "That's what attorneys are for." The pressure behind my sternum was sudden and specific. I recognized it. Not panic, not yet, but the particular cold clarity that comes when something you suspected becomes something you know. I said, "I'll be at the meeting." He said, "Good. We'll do it at the house. I'll have your mother make something." I set the phone down on the counter and stood in my kitchen for a long time. I called my attorney the following morning. Not the general practice lawyer I'd used at the start. By then I had a proper business attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei who had handled 3 contract negotiations for me and knew the company's structure thoroughly. I told her about the letter. I read her the language about all relevant holdings and decisions he had made. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have all your incorporation documents?" "Yes," I said. "The original advisory stake agreement?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "Before you go to this meeting, I want to see everything. Can you come in tomorrow?" I went in the next morning. I brought the accordion folder I kept in my home filing cabinet, the one that held the articles of incorporation, the original advisory agreement, every subsequent amendment, the operating agreement, the federal EIN confirmation, the state registration, every significant contract. The folder was thick and organized and labeled in my own handwriting. I had maintained it since month 1. Patricia spread the documents across her conference table and spent 40 minutes reading while I sat across from her. At the end, she looked up. "Your 10% advisory agreement is clear," she said. "Non-voting, no operational authority. There is nothing in here that gives him standing to restructure ownership. He said documents can be revisited." "They can," she said, "by both parties with proper process. Has he ever presented you with an amendment to this agreement?" "No." "Then whatever he thinks he's done, he doesn't have your signature on it." She paused. "What I'd want to know is what he's filed or thinks he's filed and who his attorney is." "I don't know yet." "Find out," she said. "And Marisol, don't go into that family meeting without knowing what you're walking into." I had 9 days between that phone call and Thanksgiving. I used them. The family meeting had been moved, at Renata's suggestion, communicated through my mother, from a private Saturday morning to Thanksgiving Day itself before dinner, so everyone was already together. I understood what that meant. It meant an audience. It meant the moment my father made his announcement, it would happen in front of my aunts and uncles and cousins, in the house I grew up in, with nowhere to go. My throat tightened when my mother told me about the change. Just for a moment, a quick, involuntary constriction, and then it passed and I wrote down the date on the notepad I kept by the phone. I had 9 days. I used every one of them. Thanksgiving at my parents' house smelled the way it always had. My mother's sofrito starting at 7 in the morning, the particular warmth of a house that has been heating since dawn. I arrived at 11. Most of the family was already there. My Uncle Felix. My Aunt Carmen and her husband. 2 cousins. My mother moving between the kitchen and the dining room with the focused efficiency of someone who has hosted this meal 30 times and knows exactly how long everything takes. My father was in the living room with Renata. They were standing close together near the fireplace, talking quietly. They stopped when I walked in. "Marisol," my father said. He smiled. "You look good." "Thank you," I said. "So do you." I set my coat on the rack by the door and went to find my mother in the kitchen. The meeting happened at noon before dinner the way my father had planned it. He gathered everyone into the living room. Felix and Carmen on the couch. The cousins on the chairs pulled in from the dining room. My mother standing near the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder. Renata beside my father near the fireplace, in the spot she had been in when I arrived. I sat in the armchair near the window. I had my bag with me. I had not put it down. My father stood with his hands clasped in front of him and said that he had spent the past year thinking carefully about the family's long-term financial structure. He said that he was not getting younger. He paused there, and Felix laughed the way people laugh at that sentence when they are not sure what is coming next, and that he wanted to make sure everything was properly organized while he was still in a position to do it thoughtfully. He said he had worked with his attorney over the past 8 months to consolidate and clarify ownership of the family's significant assets. He said that he was transferring operational control of my company, he called it the logistics firm, to Renata, effective January 1st. He said that he had restructured the advisory stake into a controlling interest using a document he had filed 4 months ago, and that he was formalizing Renata's role as managing partner, with himself retaining a senior advisory position. He said he hoped we could all see this as a positive step for the family. The room was quiet. My mother's hand tightened on the dish towel. I looked at my father. He was watching me with an expression I had seen before. Careful, prepared, slightly sorry in the way that people look when they have decided something is necessary and are waiting for the other person to accept it. I reached into my bag. I took out the accordion folder. I set it on my knee. "Dad," I said, "can I show you something?" He looked at the folder. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a flicker, the way a person looks when they recognize an object they weren't expecting to see. "This isn't really the time for." "It will only take a moment," I said. I opened the folder and took out the first document. I placed it on the coffee table between us. It was my articles of incorporation, the original filing with the state seal and the date stamp from 6 years ago. "This is my company," I said. "Sole Member LLC. My name. My signature. Filed and registered in the state of Ohio." I took out the second document. I placed it beside the first. "This is the advisory agreement you signed when you took the 10% stake. Non-voting. No operational authority. Your signature is on the third page." My father's jaw tightened. "Marisol." "I'm not finished," I said. I took out the third document. Patricia had obtained it 10 days ago through a public records request. A copy of the amended operating agreement my father's attorney had filed, the one he believed had restructured his advisory stake into a controlling interest. I placed it on the table. "This is what your attorney filed," I said. Patricia reviewed it. "The amendment requires the signature of the sole member to be valid. The signature on this document is not mine." I paused. "Patricia has already submitted a formal objection to the state. The filing is being reviewed. As of this week, it has no legal force." The room had gone completely still. My father looked at the documents on the table. His face had changed in a way that was hard to name. Not anger yet, something underneath anger, a kind of rearranging. "Those signatures were," he started. "Your attorney used a signature block from an earlier document," I said. Patricia identified it. "The proportions are wrong and the date formatting doesn't match my standard." She flagged it in her submission. "Marisol, I was trying to protect the business." "From what?" I said. "From me." The room was quiet. Felix was looking at his hands. Carmen was very still. My mother had not moved from the kitchen doorway. Renata said, "Dad," in a low voice. He put his hand up toward her, not looking at her, and she stopped. "I built this company," I said. "I want you to know that I know that, and that everyone in this room now knows it too." I closed the accordion folder and set it back on my knee. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. "Patricia will be in contact with your attorney next week." My father found me 20 minutes later in the kitchen. My mother had gone to check on something in the oven and we were alone. He closed the door behind him. He looked older standing there than he had looked in the living room. Something about the kitchen light or something about what had just happened. "You could have come to me," he said. "Before any of this. You could have had a conversation." I looked at him. I thought about what I wanted to say, and I organized it the way I had organized the documents in that folder, carefully, in order, so that nothing was out of place. "You told me I was overextending," I said. "That was 8 months in, when I had just signed my second anchor client. That contract represented a 38% increase in revenue. You told me you were sure I thought I knew what I was doing." He started to speak. "I'm not finished," I said. "You called my company her little venture in front of Felix. I was generating over $1 million in annual revenue. I had employees. I had contracts with liability provisions and termination clauses. It was not a little venture." He was quiet. "You came to my office once in 6 years," I said. "Once. You pushed my contract back across the table without reading it and told me I would figure it out. When I told you about the Kentucky expansion, you said I talked too fast in the meeting. I drove 9 hours that day. I ate a gas station sandwich in a parking lot so I could get back in time for my calls the next morning." My father's mouth tightened. "And when none of that worked," I said, "when the company kept growing and I kept figuring things out, and it became clear that I wasn't going to need you to rescue it or absorb it or restructure it, you filed a document with a signature that wasn't mine." I capped the pen I had been holding and set it on the counter and said nothing. "While you were deciding I wasn't capable," I said, "I rebuilt the carrier network. I renegotiated the pharmaceutical contract. I opened a line of credit because I remembered a story you told me when I was 16 about getting squeezed, and I didn't want that to happen to what I was building. I did all of that without asking you. I didn't ask you because every time I came to you, you found a way to make it smaller." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, I wanted to protect it. You wanted to control it, I said. Those are different things. I picked up my bag. I straightened the pen on the counter so it was parallel to the edge. Then I walked to the kitchen door and opened it. I'm going to stay for dinner, I said. Because Mom made sofrito since 7 this morning and I'm not going to do that to her. But this conversation is over. I walked back into the dining room. In the living room, Felix was still on the couch. He looked up when I came in and then looked away. Carmen caught my eye and held it for a moment. Not with anything she said, just held it, and then looked down at her hands. Renata was not in the room. I found out later from my mother that she had gone to sit in my father's office with the door closed for most of the meal. My mother told me this 2 weeks later, on the phone, in the careful way she relayed information she thought I needed without positioning herself on either side. My mother has practiced that particular skill for 30 years. I have never been able to decide whether I admire it or am saddened by it. The dinner was quiet. My father sat at the head of the table and served the turkey the way he always did, with the same handled fork, and made the same small joke about the wishbone that he made every year. Nobody laughed quite right. My cousins talked about something else, a trip one of them was planning, a job change. The sofrito was good. It is always good. I left at 4 o'clock. I hugged my mother in the doorway for a long moment, longer than usual. She pressed her hand flat against my back the way she used to when I was small. I know, she said. She didn't say what she knew. She didn't need to. Patricia resolved the filing dispute in February. The amended operating agreement my father's attorney had submitted was formally invalidated by the state. My father did not contest it. His attorney, I learned later, had advised him that contesting it would expose them to a much more serious problem than avoided filing. The 10% advisory stake remained what it had always been. Non-voting, no operational authority, exactly what we had signed 6 years ago. I have not changed the agreement since then. My father still holds his 10%. He has not raised the subject again. We talk occasionally about ordinary things, about my mother, about the weather, about nothing that costs either of us anything. I don't know what to call what we have now. It is not estrangement and it is not closeness. It is the particular careful distance of two people who both know what happened and have agreed, without saying so, not to talk about it directly. Renata and I have spoken twice since Thanksgiving. Both times were brief and practical, logistics around a family birthday, a question about my mother's doctor. We were polite. I think we will remain polite. I don't think we will be more than that, and I have made my peace with that in the way you make peace with something that is true rather than something you wanted. What I think about now, when I think about those 6 years, is not the filing or the Thanksgiving meeting or even the documents spread across my father's coffee table. What I think about is the accordion folder. The way I had kept it from month 1 in my home filing cabinet. Every document labeled in my own handwriting. Every amendment filed. Every contract, every EIN confirmation, every page of the operating agreement. I had maintained it not because I expected to need it, but because I was building something real, and real things deserve a real record. The folder was the proof of what I had done. But more than that, it was proof that I had known from the beginning that what I was doing was worth keeping track of. That it was worth the care. That it was not a little venture. There is something I have come to believe about the people who underestimate you consistently, over many years, in the quiet accumulated way that doesn't look like cruelty until you lay all the moments side by side. They are not always wrong about who you were when you started. Sometimes they knew you before you knew yourself. The mistake they make is deciding that who you were at the beginning is who you will always be, that the starting point is also the ceiling. They stop watching. They keep the old picture. The thing about building something real is that it doesn't need their picture to be accurate. It just needs you to keep going to the office. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had someone in your life who kept the old picture while you were busy changing, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the right story at the right moment is the thing that keeps a person going. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental.